I think a lot of carbon removal and storage solutions require some assumptions, maybe a leap of faith to say, okay, well, we understand in theory that doing A, B, and C actions will remove CO2 from the atmosphere, but CO2 is an invisible, inert, largely inert gas that is really hard to trace. And again, even in climate science, so much of our understanding of global carbon fluxes, sources, and sinks are based on assumptions.
Carbonsations, today's carbon industry leaders.
Welcome to the Carbonsations podcast, where we speak to some of the leading figures in the emerging carbon industry. Today, we're joined by Garrett Boudinot, the founder and CEO of carbon removal company Vycarb, based in New York City. Garrett, thank you so much for being here. It's a pleasure to have you. And if you're familiar with the format, you'll know that before we get to the business and technology matters, we always want to get to know our guests' background a little bit better and understand how you wound up in this still very new space to begin with. So with that said, I'd love it if you could please share with us a bit what you used to do before starting Vycarb.
Sure, and it's my pleasure to be here. So thanks for having me. Yeah, most of my career has been focused on climate change. I think I typically say I was classically trained in climate science, primarily using analytical chemistry as a way to trace how climate change and carbon cycling were evolving from increases in CO2 in the atmosphere. So some of that was focused on how ecosystems were responding to climate change. Some of that was just trying to trace fundamental changes in carbon cycling in the ocean. About halfway through my PhD, as many, I think, PhD students experience, I kind of went through an existential crisis where I said, oh my gosh, I'm developing all these tools to understand how bad the problem is. And I, as an individual, don't need to know that the problem is bad anymore. I get it. What are we going to do about it? And so actually, I, after my PhD, worked in conservation for a little while, thinking, okay, well, this is an area where folks are focused on adaptation and climate solutions. And then as the carbon removal market started to get a little bit more traction, a bit more research dollars going into it, I was asked to help start a research program at Cornell University on carbon removal proper, particularly in soils, and using those same analytical chemistry skills I had used to trace carbon cycling from climate change, and now using those analytical chemistry skills to trace whether or not carbon removal was working, particularly in these dynamic, heterogeneous natural environments like soils, like water, where folks recognized carbon was already naturally being sequestered. And as listeners of this podcast are well aware, all the different ways that folks can manipulate those soils or waters to accelerate those natural reactions. So I think, most folks understand the theory of how plants can absorb carbon and that can go into soils, or how the ocean can absorb carbon. But that research program that I was a part of was really focused on, again, trying to trace whether or not and how effective, how quickly, and where those reactions were taking place. And in doing that, I saw results were all over the place. Sometimes a lot, we could detect that a lot of carbon was being sequestered, sometimes not so much. There's some literature out there saying in response to some of these practices, carbon is even released. And so I became really obsessed with the need to integrate measurement of carbon removal and sequestration with the actual practice. And ultimately, it was in developing new analytical methods for that, but also new methods to make carbon removal and sequestration measurable that led to Vycarb. And then the final thing I'll say is the final kind of step for me to start the company and step away from the academic background was I did receive an Activate Fellowship. So this is a science entrepreneurship fellowship based in the US that takes scientists like myself who have an idea for kind of a scaled up, high impact commercial enterprise, and provides the training, initial R&D support, initial funding for scientists like myself to be able to successfully commercialize and scale up those ideas. And so once I took that Activate Fellowship, that was the final catalyst for Vycarb starting.
Awesome. Thank you. So moving on to Vycarb, the reason you're here, why did you decide to actually found your own company? And why focus on carbon removal, of all the ways to, contribute to climate action?
Oh, sure. I'll start with that second question. So My whole background has been focused on carbon cycling and again, really wanting to use my skills for solutions. This emerging carbon removal market as it was starting to, and I say emerging market really meaning increasing buyer and demand side, highlighted that there are folks who recognize I think folks who listen to this will be familiar with the bathtub problem or the bathtub metaphor, however we want to describe it, but there was increasing incentives in market demand and interest in actually removing CO2 from the atmosphere rather than just stopping emissions. And I was not trained as an engineer, so I don't really understand how increased battery storage works, which is required for reducing emissions. I don't understand how a lot of renewable energy sources work, which is required for decarbonization. I do really well understand the global carbon cycle and the sources and sinks and the natural reactions that convert CO2 into different non-greenhouse gas forms. That is my area of expertise. And I saw the carbon removal market and opportunity as a niche in which I was actually, given my background in climate science and carbon cycling, very well suited to contribute to. So that's why I was drawn to carbon removal and storage generally. And then, within Vycarb, I think I love that question, like why actually start a separate company? When I started Vycarb, there was some interest in, or some initial whisperings and initial companies recognizing that oceans already absorb CO2. Maybe we can change the chemistry of the oceans to allow it to absorb more CO2. There's a boom, or that was maybe the start of the boom of enhanced rock weathering companies, where more and more were coming out saying, we're going to spread basalt on soils. That's going to drive chemical reactions that help soils absorb more CO2 or soil waters store CO2 rather than having it released to the atmosphere. And I was looking at all of those and saying, well, none of those do what I, as just a passionate climate concerned citizen, want to see, which is, yes, let's leverage these natural carbon sinks and accelerate these natural reactions. But again, let's do it in a way that I, as someone who understands carbon cycle fluxes and data, has very high certainty that this is actually removing carbon on timescales that I care about. And I think that's really, that was not something then, and even still today, that we see a huge number of solutions that do this. I think a lot of carbon removal and storage solutions require some assumptions, maybe a leap of faith to say, okay, well, we understand in theory that doing A, B, and C actions will remove CO2 from the atmosphere, but CO2 is an invisible, largely inert gas that is really hard to trace. And again, even in climate science, so much of our understanding of global carbon fluxes, sources, and sinks are based on assumptions. And so we're just going to take that as the status quo, and we'll do these practices and accept some of those assumptions. And I just said, look, if we're going to be adding a bunch of transportation to the supply chain, adding a bunch of upstream material and energy requirements for some of these carbon removal practices, I want to be really sure that it is removing the amount of carbon folks say, not just from actually removing carbon, but then of course the downstream market applications of those, for offsetting corporate emissions, for example. And so that's where I didn't see opportunities out there to, for example, work at a company that was doing that. And frankly, I just didn't even hear that as part of the conversation. And so I thought starting a company like Vycarb based on a idea in a kind of technology innovation space to develop a real-time carbon sensing technology, essentially an idea and innovation around how we can better measure carbon, and then an actual carbon removal process that allows the carbon removal to be measurable and uses, in our case, in what I came up with, water as the medium for capturing and sequestering CO2. So again, going back to leveraging natural carbon sinks, leveraging natural carbon fluxes, but accelerating those, but then coupling that to a way that can be measured and is measurable and has a measurement solution. That was something that, again, there was a niche in the market, I felt. And I think Vycarb has kind of continued to be the leader in that niche of a fully measured approach to the removal and storage of carbon.
That's truly really, really fascinating. And you are absolutely right. That's definitely not something that's talked about in this industry. For real, like for as long as I've been doing this podcast, you're the first person to mention that a lot of this work is based on assumption. And yeah, so I really appreciate you first saying that, but then actually, doing something about it. I was wondering if you could actually tell us more about how you approach measuring the carbon that you sequester and just in general, like if you could tell us more about your technology.
Totally. So our process is similar in chemistry to, as I mentioned, some enhanced rock weathering or ocean alkalinity, where we're leveraging the natural carbon cycling in water. So all water has three forms of inorganic carbon molecules: CO2, that greenhouse gas that we're all aware of, but then HCO3 bicarbonate, and CO3, which is carbonate. And those three, CO2, bicarbonate, and carbonate, are present in all waters at all times. And the relative proportion of them is dependent on the pH and other kind of chemical conditions of the water. And so what we do is we convert dissolved CO2 in water into bicarbonate and carbonate. And CO2 obviously is a greenhouse gas that can outgas to the atmosphere or can go from the atmosphere into water. But once it's converted to bicarbonate and carbonate under the right conditions, it stays locked away as those dissolved, inert, inorganic carbon molecules for on the order of 100,000 years. And so it's an incredibly permanent form of carbon storage that we can drive very quickly with a chemical reaction. And is bicarbonate in the ocean is the largest pool of carbon on the surface of the planet. And so it's, we can take all 1.4 trillion tons of CO2 that humans have emitted, convert it all to bicarbonate and put it in the ocean, and it will make less than a 5% change in the total pool of bicarbonate in the ocean. So just thinking about scalability, this is a highly scalable form of carbon storage. The way we convert that CO2 in water into bicarbonate is by increasing the pH of the water. So CO2 forms carbonic acid, makes the water acidic. If you just increase the pH of the water, that carbonic acid converts to bicarbonate. And the way we do that is by adding ions like calcium, magnesium, sodium. So these are positively charged ions that are present in a lot of naturally abundant minerals and rocks. And so again, very similar to what folks have heard of with enhanced rock weathering and ocean alkalinity, where we're adding geologic sources of magnesium and calcium. And that then creates a pH change in the water to convert CO2 to bicarbonate. So that's the kind of fundamental science of how our approach works, which is nothing new in the carbon removal space. And so again, where our innovation and niche comes in is how we do that in a controlled and measurable fashion. So we essentially designed a system that drives that chemical reaction in what's referred to often as a closed system, which is sometimes confusing language because it is, water is continuously flowing through it. So it's open on two ends, but it's differentiated again from a lot of other similar carbon removal approaches, and that we're able to control the inputs and outputs. So we can control the flow of natural water through our reactor, add those magnesium and calcium containing minerals within, and I refer to it as a reactor. So it's essentially a pipe form factor inside of which we're able to control the flow of water and the dissolution of these different calcium and magnesium bearing minerals. And the way we've designed that is it increases the dissolution of those in the presence of carbonic acid alone, which allows us to just create the right amount of bicarbonate, so neutralize or reduce the CO2 that's coming in from the waters, convert it to bicarbonate, such that by the time the water leaves our reactor, those minerals have been dissolved, the CO2 has been converted to bicarbonate right there in our system, and we're then able to quantify that. And I guess that's the final part here is I just described, the fundamental chemistry and then the system, the form factor that we've designed that drives that chemistry. But another big part of our innovation and technology development is on actually sensor technology. So this is a sensing approach that we've designed that allows us to, in real time, quantify those three kinds of dissolved carbon: CO2, bicarbonate, and carbonate, in water. And so we couple that at the front and the back of our reactor. So we're able to quantify how much CO2, bicarbonate, and carbonate are coming in the natural waters. That's been used to detect excess CO2. So how much CO2 is present in these waters above 425, above 500 parts per million, something like that. And then that's what then drives our addition of the magnesium and calcium, that dissolution. Then on the back end, we're able to show not only that CO2 went down, the CO2 can go down from a lot of things, photosynthesis, outgassing, change in temperature, all that. So not just that CO2 went down, but that it was converted to bicarbonate and carbonate. So that it was actually converted to a stable, permanent form of carbon storage before that water is then released back out. So that's the final kind of not just having a way to do carbon removal and storage that is measurable, but then an actual approach that allows us to measure it.
Okay, thank you so much. I also wanted to talk to you about the pilot project that you guys recently unveiled in New York City's East River. First off, congratulations on the launch. It's certainly a very exciting milestone, but I'm curious as to really any details you can share with us as far as like CO2 removal capacity goes or how the project is moving along in general.
Totally. Yeah. We were very excited to get that going kind of last fall. I think we had over 100 folks during New York City Climate Week come out for kind of our initial launch. We did a series of open houses. And so some of the listeners might have actually already put boots on the ground at the facility. It's at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. So on the East River, kind of with the New York City skyline just in the background. The East River that it's deployed in is a great example of a naturally high CO2 water body. So, we're measuring CO2 concentrations typically on the order of 2,000 parts per million. So lots of excess CO2 that is outgassing to the atmosphere under normal conditions that are ideally suited for us to convert to bicarbonate, reduce that outgassing, remove and store that as bicarbonate. This is our third pilot for context. So we started with a very small kind of milligrams per year scale system just to show that we could in fact drive the reaction in real natural waters, could in fact fully measure it and could control the reaction to make sure that it's safe to release those waters. And then we did a second pilot at Trust for Governors Island. That was a long-term deployment, kind of at kilograms per year scale, same objectives, but also showing that we can do this continuously. And then, we launched this third pilot last fall, and it's essentially a test bed for us to continue to iteratively scale up. We have regulatory permission to do this up to 100 tons per year. And so, when we first started, we were doing piecemeal tests of our new reactor system that allows us to get higher flow, piecemeal tests of our measurement integration, adding different mineral types, which is something that our technology allows us to do. So different sources of magnesium and calcium. As we did those initial tests, we were able to kind of optimize the core process and have been slowly kind of adding core components to that. So we've got a 25-ton mineral silo connected to this. So we're able to get industrial 20-some ton truckloads of mineral alkalinity delivered to this so that we can continuously dose the water and drive this process. It's an incredibly low energy requiring system because we're leveraging natural water flow. And so we're able to power this entirely with solar panels that are installed on site on the system itself. And I would say starting in about November, so shortly after New York City Climate Week, we turned this on for full-time deployment. And so now it is kind of constantly running and again, measuring the incoming CO2, converting that to bicarbonate, showing that we're able to do that. And in the process, we're getting lots of data on natural variability. So we're seeing how changes in diurnal, so daily, but also weekly, monthly, seasonal variability is impacting the CO2 concentration of the water, the other chemical conditions of the water that all influence how the process works. So we're able to optimize the process itself. We're also seeing how the fundamental hardware changes under different conditions. And so no surprise that, this winter in New York, we've had some pretty darn cold days. And so seeing how pumps and hoses that are moving water in behave when it's very cold and freezing has been very helpful for us to optimize through. And now we're in a process of kind of, as we optimize, also scaling up. So we currently have one reactor in the water. This is kind of removing on the order of tons per year, depending on what the natural variability is. Anywhere from half a ton to a couple tons is what we're seeing. And now our process is increasing the size of that reactor and the numbers of those reactors so that we can get up to that 100 ton per year capacity. So that's kind of our technical objectives here. And then the final thing I'll say with this pilot is a lot of this, now that this is working at a commercially relevant scale, which is to say we're working in tons and not in milligrams, we're now working with a number of independent partners as well, who are validating our core sensor technology, but also validating the actual ecosystem impacts. And so again, showing that there are no negative ecosystem impacts, or ideally even positive ecosystem impacts, as we're reducing the acidification of those waters, but also showing that the CO2 bicarbonate and carbonate and other chemical conditions that we're measuring in real time with our own technology is confirmed, validated, and corroborated with traditional methods of measuring those same analytes that are done with some university partners. So that's a big objective of this current pilot. It's right behind our office, which is very nice as we're constantly optimizing. It's a very accessible place, obviously, in New York City, for partners to come visit, for those independent verification groups to work at. And we really see this as the final and really necessary step before we scale up further to, again, have real data showing that this is safe for the water, have real data showing that this is removing and permanently storing CO2 at the rate that we think it is based on our own technology. Once we have that validation through the natural variability of a few months, then we'll really be able to scale this up, go to new locations.
Do you have a timeline as to when you plan on reaching that 100-ton scale? And separately from that, I also wanted to ask, do you plan on licensing the technology once you're kind of on the road to scaling?
Sure. Timelines. So we're able to keep this here through the summer is what our current regulatory permission is. And there are some other kind of use case tests that we're actually currently doing that we'll be able to speak a bit more about in the coming weeks here. All to say, we hope to be at that full capacity probably in the next couple months. But one of the things that we're seeing, and I think this is just a really useful insight to scaling climate solutions generally, is as we scale up, we adopt new or alter processes. So, for example, our reactor's moving water. And so the way that reactor is designed as it is moving more water changes the behavior of that reactor. And so that kind of scaling and optimization is a constantly iterative process. So, to be determined if we're going to be at that full capacity in 6 weeks or 12 weeks. But that's kind of the scale that we're working on. And then in terms of licensing, I think that's a great question. I feel like a lot of just generally technology and hardware, hard tech startups like to say, oh yeah, and then at some point we'll license the technology because that sounds really nice because, then someone else does the hard work of building it and deploying it and we can just get some royalties on that. I think the details of how that works are always harder to define and very kind of opportunistic and customer specific. So regardless of, whether it's a licensing model or what the exact revenue model is, we do plan on transitioning to what we call more generally an enabling technology model. So what that means is, similar to a licensing model, maybe in some scenarios, we are limited in our scale up pathway in the future by the size of our team, our geographic footprint, et cetera. And the tech that we've designed, again, having this measurement integration, doing the removal and storage, being very low energy, kind of enables the ability to be deployed in a distributed fashion. So we don't need one massive facility doing 1 million tons or 1 billion tons. We can very easily, and for some ecosystem reasons, very reasonably as well, deploy this in a number of different locations to maybe not have 1 million tons per year impact, maybe 1,000 to 10,000 tons per year impact. And that lends itself well, again, maybe not to Vycarb owning and operating that, but Vycarb producing the hardware, managing some of the kind of autonomy and data generation remotely, but actually putting that as a tool in the hands of local communities, local organizations around the world to operate this themselves. And so that might, maybe that's a licensing model. Maybe that's just a strong partnership. Maybe it's a just proper equipment provider for project developers, but that's really where we ultimately want to get to. And a lot of why we're testing through all of these different natural conditions at a smaller scale now, so that once we've kind of built future systems that can go to other partners, we're confident that it will have the performance that we and those partners expect from it.
So, given your experience in the field so far, what are some of the main challenges you've faced as a carbon removal company? And more broadly, perhaps, what are generally the main issues that CDR startups have to deal with?
I mean, I think generally it's I think you used the word nascent earlier, and that's certainly the word that I use. Like, it's a nascent field, and that's from the demand and the supply side. I think, when we started in late 2022, there was a belief that, we're at the very initial curve of a exponential hockey stick boom of a market that is going to rapidly scale, and we're going to see new customers buying more and more carbon removal every day. I think that's been less dramatic than some had hoped. And I think certainly given recent policy changes in the US, there's a lot of just uncertainty around where this market is going. Obviously, we wouldn't be here if we weren't bullish on the opportunity and didn't see that this is a growing market that will continue to grow given global impacts of climate change and corporate and governmental climate incentives. However, that is just certainly, if not a practical challenge companies are facing, certainly a messaging and kind of social challenge that a lot of us are facing. I think it's also interesting to see that there's, so I would call that challenges or uncertainty on the demand side. Also on the supply side, like, it's just a constantly evolving field where there are more and more companies who all have their own, sometimes niche that they've kind of formed, just like we have with our approach. Sometimes not so much a niche, but just kind of replicating what's been out there. And so trying to navigate all of the new companies that are coming online is just something that's really interesting to see, the different ways that folks are thinking about removing carbon and how that all fits into these different portfolios of climate solutions. In terms of the actual technology itself, one of the things that has not been a challenge that I know for lots of startups can be is just getting good talent on the team. That's obviously what, for doing something no one's done before, for being kind of at the forefront of innovation and new research and development, that requires really good, hardworking, smart people. And I think and frankly, I think the whole industry has had no problem getting really smart, talented, hardworking people from lots of different industries involved and interested and engaged in using those skills that they've gathered for climate solutions, just because of the mission alignment, right? There are so many folks around the world that not only, want to maybe use their corporate climate commitments to pay for climate solutions, but want to themselves use their skills to contribute to that. So we've been very fortunate to not have that as a challenge. However, we are, this is hardware development. This is moving molecules. This is for us moving water and moving minerals. And that is just that requires a lot of supply chain partnerships, a lot of capital, a lot of time, frankly, just to do development that I think in 2025, so much of kind of technology development is with a mindset of a lot of software companies where iteration can be very fast, where iteration can be very capital light, and where the whole carbon removal industry is just in a different world where, again, we're moving molecules, we're building actual physical systems, and that takes time. And, as some of our, partners like to say, Rome wasn't built in a day, but the earth isn't getting any cooler. And so I think we all just have that inherent sense of urgency that there's no rate of scale up that we could be doing that is fast enough for the challenge, for the market. And frankly, that's a challenge, but it's also a really exciting reason to be in this industry. It is moving fast. There is growing demand for it to move fast. And I think we're all here to do that.
Right. And since you mentioned the changing political landscape in the US, a lot of folks are pretty alarmed about the recent developments. Like just last week, I think it was the US Energy Secretary Chris Wright called the pledge to achieve net zero by 2050 a sinister goal. Are you at all worried about this change in direction? Like I know you said that you're bullish, but do you have any kind of predictions, or maybe you're already seeing some kind of effects on the industry?
Yeah, this is maybe a time where we can be glad that the carbon removal industry isn't dependent on compliance markets in the US. I think there's in the past been a lot of kind of analyses that have said, well, ultimately, if carbon removal can move to a compliance market, then that will solve magically all of the problems that the industry has. And I think we see, compliance with certain regulations as administrations and regulations change can be as uncertain as voluntary markets. And so I think for us, we've kind of been grateful that, this is not our business model is not dependent on US government perspectives on, climate solutions, but it is instead dependent on or currently working with the private sector, specific companies and their climate pledges. I think, we were one of the companies selected for the Department of Energy's Carbon Dioxide Removal Purchase Prize, which was a transformative, a potential impact of that cannot, I don't think, be overstated policy change by the US government last year to essentially develop a prize through the Department of Energy to facilitate the first purchases of durable, high quality carbon removal in the US. Vycarb was selected as one of the semifinalists. So we just submitted our phase 2 application along with about 20 other companies. And so we've seen opportunities there. And I know there's some uncertainty of, the pace at which that prize will move forward. But ultimately, we're not dependent on that. And, the other thing is a lot of our revenue to date in the voluntary market have been from international companies even. So not here domestically in the US. So, am I, as an American citizen who cares about responses to climate change, worried generally? For sure. Am I confident that the voluntary CDR market and Vycarb will be able to weather this storm, or maybe not even storm, but these dark times? Yeah, I'm quite confident of that, just given the voluntary commitments in the private sector that are out there, both domestically and internationally.
All right. Okay. So that's optimistic, certainly. And I do have one final question for you, Garrett. Even though you did kind of mention your long-term plans, but I do have to ask this, it's tradition on the podcast, about your upcoming announcements, anything in the pipeline that you could already give us kind of a sneak peek at?
Sure. Yeah. I mentioned we've got some new applications of this tech that we're currently testing at our Brooklyn pilot. Nothing yet to report, but that will certainly be, keep an eye out for more updates on some performance metrics that we're hitting and applications of this system at our pilot in Brooklyn that we'll plan to announce in the coming weeks. And then, as we increase the reliability and performance of this current system, we do have a pipeline of some really exciting projects here in the US and internationally that we plan on deploying. So not just more news on the Brooklyn system, but more news on a wider Vycarb footprint around the world. So nothing concrete that we're ready to report now, but definitely want folks to keep an eye out for more.
All right. Certainly looking forward to that. Garrett, thank you so much for this lovely conversation and the insights you've shared with us today. And it was really great to have you. Thank you so much.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Carbonsations podcast and would like to hear more conversations like this, please be sure to subscribe. We really appreciate the support.